there, and welcome to the channel. This is the place where we take a look at the life of William Shakespeare and what it was like to live in turn of the 17th century England. If you like history, then this is the place for you. Hit that like and subscribe button because we're here every week. This week, we're looking at the history of women's medical care in Shakespeare's lifetime. Specifically, we're going to explore what medical science understood and what they were missing about human reproduction, and who were the people functioning as the OBGYNs for 17th century women. Let's find out right now on That Shakespeare Life. When I first ran across this part of history, it really surprised me and threw me for a loop because it was a lot of stuff that I didn't know about yet. Now, as I've gotten into this, I have learned that not only is this part of history extremely vast, but there's lots of people much smarter than me who have already covered this in swaths. So I'm going to go ahead and tell you that I'm going to share with you what I learned about this topic, but it's well worth looking into some of the books and resources I'm going to recommend in the show notes today if this is a topic you would like to learn more about, because there's much more than I could cram in today's episode. The first step in the journey towards understanding female medical care in Shakespeare's lifetime is to take a look at some of the medical manuals that were being printed in the 16th and 17th century. The one that I've spent the most time with was printed by Laqueuer, and it was published in 1616. Now, Laqueuer was an anatomist, which means he studied human body parts and he cataloged what he found in illustrations that he put together in printed manuals. When you're looking through Laqueuer's diagrams, you'll find a high level of detail about human anatomy, and his drawings are actually very good artistically in terms of their detail and level of detail. And it makes sense when you think about it because these manuals were put together based on human cadavers. There were people who were, just to put a real fine point on it for you here, they were dissected like human science lab projects for the purpose of understanding these various parts. And there's a lot of ethical questions about doing that. But in the 17th century, that was how advancements in medical science was done. And so when you're looking through these books, you kind of have to put aside the macabre element to these books because it is kind of gross to think about. But when you look at Crook's drawings, he has a wide range of body systems. I mean, he's drawing diagrams of the heart and the intestines, even the brain. There's cross sections, and you've got diagrams of the nervous system. And he shows lots of nerves and just the, atrium and ventricles. And Laqueuer correctly names many parts of the male anatomy. A lot of them I just didn't think the 17th century had the medical knowledge to even know about. But he labels things like the epididymis, the peritoneum, of course, the penis and the testicles. But for the female anatomy, he has the fallopian tubes drawn, but he labels them as spermatical veins. And then the uterus is definitely drawn in the shape of a male's primary sexual organ, and it's placed right inside the abdomen of a woman, and it's labeled womb. As a woman, I was a little offended, gotta say. When I saw it, I was like, come on, we can't get our own terms here? I don't understand this. So that was a little alarming as well. But throughout the text, there's no mention of anatomically correct female body parts. There's no cervix, no vagina, and other anatomical words for female body parts either. Like there's no ovaries, there's not even a uterus. That word doesn't show up in his book. And at first I thought these omissions were just out of ignorance, like maybe they hadn't learned enough science to know about this. But when the uterus is drawn as a man's primary organ, I got the distinct impression that medical science for Shakespeare's lifetime held a decidedly male-centric view of the world, and that this was kind of a male washing of the female body. I mean, they labeled all the female body parts with male names. It really seemed like they were insisting that female bodies were, in fact, actually male. I don't have an answer for why this was supposed to be the conclusion that you come to here. But in the early 2000s, Tom Laqueuer wrote two books that address this idea called a one-sex model, where men and women are portrayed as the same gender. And so there's no separation for women at all. Now, this obviously raised some questions for me as a woman. I immediately started firing off with questions in my brain of like, well, what did this do to women's medical care? Did they have doctors that they went to? If you had a problem with your uterus or your ovaries, or you have issues like an ectopic pregnancy or ovarian cancer or who knows what, who do you go to? Did they have, you obviously couldn't go to a doctor who specialized in gynecology. That didn't exist. So who was the OBGYN for the 17th century? The answer to that question is midwives. Midwives were not only more knowledgeable about women's bodies than medical doctors, but they were the reigning experts on childbirth, and they knew how women's bodies worked. In fact, when a woman would give birth, the male doctor was not even allowed in the room except in cases of extreme emergency. And that, whether or not it was extreme enough that we needed the doctor, was typically determined by the midwife themselves. So, by all indications, the midwife, even though they were not allowed to be university educated, they weren't allowed to hold a professional title like doctor. They were, in fact, more medically knowledgeable about women's bodies than the professional physician at this time. There were even surgeons who invented surgical tools like a speculum. And when they wrote about their invention or marketed this invention, they were directing that to midwives because it was the midwife that was going to handle this part of medicine for the 17th century. Now I know what you're thinking because I thought it too. And the question is, obviously, women have been having babies well before the Renaissance. So surely this wasn't a new concept. Women's bodies have needed care and specific care for a long time. So when did we start doing this? You'd be right about this question. Obstetrics and gynecology can be traced all the way back to classical and medieval foundations. The earliest person I discovered in researching this episode, and, don't shoot me for using the phrase the earliest, okay? But Soranus, 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 wrote in about 100 AD. He wrote a book called, fittingly, Gynecology. So obviously there was knowledge at least back then. But then other physicians have written about gynecology too. Galen, who was famous during Shakespeare's lifetime, even shows up by name in some of Shakespeare's plays. He was considered like the foundation of medicine. Definitely his works, along with some others. He wasn't the only one. But he was, I'm having trouble remembering the other guy. I think it was Periclesis, but there was like competing medical schools of thought. Galen was a huge guy, Are you team Galen? Are you team Periclesis? You had options. Bringing it up to Shakespeare's general vicinity after Galen, one of the first European books on gynecology made widely available was written by, bear with me as I butcher his name, Eucharius Rosalind. I hope that's right. He wrote a book called The Rose Garden. It was published in German in 1513, and it was hugely popular. It got reprinted over and over and over again, definitely printed during Shakespeare's lifetime. I think it was printed all the way up until 1608. But the exciting thing about his book for me was that it was written to midwives. Thank you, Rosalind. His books talk about medically how to handle female situations. So it talks about all of the different steps involved in labor and delivery, how to take care of a new baby. It walks through pregnancy issues and how to address those. It even goes over, what's going to happen in a birth, how to handle the afterbirth, what you're going to do with the uterus, and all this stuff is going to be expelled and you got to handle that. It goes over all of that in extreme detail. And it is essentially a medical text, but for midwives. Now, this book was translated several times because, like I said, the first one was German, but it gets reprinted and translated lots and lots and lots. I was able to find it was translated into French, Dutch, Spanish, Danish, English, and Czech well on into the 18th century. So I went looking for some online copies of the English version so we could see what exactly Rosalind was talking about. And I found one English version from 1526, and he describes, of course, how conception occurs. And then he describes female anatomy. What was funny about this was that he uses phrases like womb port and matrix to describe a woman's body parts down there. And there was one mention of the fact that in Latin, this is called a vulva, but in English, we're going to call it a womb port. Okay. And he goes over at the beginning about how he doesn't want anyone being crass or rude with what he's going to write about. So I guess maybe he's just intentionally trying to be delicate. But anyway, In a French version of this book from the 1530s, I found illustrations. So there's diagrams of the womb, and he gives instructions on how to handle a breech birth and how to handle twins. And you see all of these diagrams showing up. So it seems that anatomists and actual medical doctors not only had very little understanding about the female body, but there was an active wall between them and midwives. There was definitely this cultural gap in medical care where doctors essentially said, I don't deal in female issues, which I feel like is just a violation of the Hippocratic Oath and a huge disservice to women. So I don't understand how that was functional, but God save the midwives, because the midwives were not only responsible for women's care, but they were demonstrably more educated in the female reproductive system and the female body and body parts, and certainly more able to administer medical care to women as a result. So no wonder midwives were in charge of the birthing room. Everyone, including the doctor, knew that the midwife was the one who needed to be there. Now, obviously, there's a ton more history to unpack about this topic and lots more to explore than I could cram into the study today. I am looking for a guest. I've got a couple of people I've sent emails to, and we're talking. Hopefully, I will put together a podcast episode on this topic for you where we can address other questions that I have, like ectopic pregnancies and menopause and contraception, and where I have so many questions. So hopefully we'll get that on the podcast. If you like this history, let me know about it in the comments below. And of course, subscribe to the channel, because we are here every week with fun history questions just like this one. That's it for this week. Thank you for watching. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.